Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Matarese, and before I get started on the episode today, I'd just like to take care of the usual housekeeping. For starters, paid requests are now reopened. If you're interested in submitting a disaster request, please double-check the list of requests I most recently posted to the podcast's Facebook and Tumblr to make sure your request has not already been made. Also, please look through past episodes to verify I haven't already covered the disaster in question. To submit a request, you can send a donation of $30 or more to the podcast's PayPal at disasteraria@mail.com, on Venmo at Disaster Area Podcast, or on Cash App at Disaster Area Pod. Just add the name of the disaster to the notes on your donation. If you have an idea for an episode subject but you're not sure if it qualifies, feel free to message me and I can approve one way or the other. It usually qualifies. I can assure you I have a very large umbrella over which I will consider disasters, and if you can present it with a good enough argument, I will almost inevitably say yes. The subject for this particular episode was chosen by Pat. I'd like to thank Pat for the donation and for the request, and also say that I am very sorry for your son's loss. Now, if you'd still like to help support the podcast in another way, you can do so with a one-time donation through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App. I also have Zelle, which I just got, and on a per-episode basis through Patreon at www.patreon.com/disasterareapodcast. A per-episode donation of even as little as $1 an episode can help me do things like pay the rent and keep the lights on. And if you do join the Patreon, you will get new episodes ad-free as soon as I record them, rather than waiting until they are released. So if you do become a patron, I would very much appreciate it. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook at Disaster Area Podcast, on Instagram at Disaster Area Pod, and on Tumblr at Disaster Area-podcast. Also, please think about rating and reviewing the podcast on Apple Podcast, Audible, Spotify, wherever you might listen to this on. And as always, the sources for each new episode can be found at disasterareapodcast.wordpress.com and in the episode description wherever you might be listening to me. I would also like to preemptively apologize for any mispronunciations I might make of any Korean words or names, or any mistakes I might make in regards to Korean culture and references. I'd also like to say I tried to make sure that all of the names of Korean citizens and people in this episode was I did try to make sure that they were all the way that they're supposed to be, which is last name first and then their first name. And so I hopefully have gotten them all correct in translation from, some of my sources are Western, some are not. So I have to kind of go with that. But hopefully I've gotten these all correct. As far as I can tell, I have. I'd like to thank you all for being patient with me as well. I've had some health issues over the past month, just some mental, some physical, but I am really, really grateful that you guys are patient with me and put up with all of the stressors and health problems that I have every so often, whether it be physical or mental. So with all of that taken care of, thank you very much for listening, and welcome to Disaster Area. Episode 242, The Itaewon Halloween Crush, Part 2, October 29th, 2022. 159 people deceased, 196 injured. So, where we ended the last episode was with Mr. Nam standing outside of his store, seeing this pile of young people in Halloween costumes, out for a good time on Halloween night, and just backed up in the alleyway right in front of his store, piled high, tangled up, fighting for their lives. Even before the crowd in Itaewon shifted into a deadly gear, people in the area were contacting the police to ask a very simple question. Say, this crowd here is a bit much. Care to send some officers down here to manage crowd control? It wasn't as though officers would have far to go. Only a few hundred meters from the alley was the local police station, the substation, in which there were officers who hadn't even been dispatched onto the streets that night. One of the officers in the Itaewon station that night, Assistant Inspector Kim Baek-gyom, headed out to check out the report of an altercation just after 10 p.m. It didn't take him long to reach the alleyway area, getting there between 10:10 and 10:50 p.m. Now, depending on what source you look at, either he went directly to the alleyway and found the altercation. He was dealing with the altercation somewhere else, and he ended up, finding his way to the alley, something along those lines. But at some point, Assistant Inspector Kim ended up here and saw what was happening and starts trying to deal with the fact that he finds this nightmarish tangle of screaming people stacked up in the alleyway like cordwood. Some of the people he could see lay terrifyingly still on the stones. He shows up and he can already tell there are people who are deceased. Desperate, Officer Kim, or Sergeant Kim, I've seen him referred to as, found his way to the top of the alleyway on World Food Street. In a video which circulated on social media almost immediately after the disaster, Officer Kim stands amongst the bustling crowd attempting to direct them away from the alley. It is nearly impossible to hear him over the people in the crowd, the music pumping from nearby bars and clubs. You've got like K-pop and Nick Jonas and all these different songs that are pounding out of these clubs and these bars, and Officer Kim is trying to yell over everything, and he is very hard to hear, but he does not mince words. People are dying, he calls out. Everyone move this way. Please cooperate. He sounds and looks very distressed. He is basically begging people to listen to him. And he didn't have a megaphone, he didn't have a public address system or anything else to get the attention of those around him, but in the video, he's the only police officer visible. Seeing just one person in a position of authority at that moment gave people someone to organize around. This is someone who is clearly not there looking for looking undercover, looking for a drug bust or anything like that. This is an officer who is yelling at you with a very, with kind of fear in his eyes, kind of saying, get back, don't go this way, go that way, please do what I say. There are, people are dying, you have to go that way. And people start really listening to him. As Sergeant Kim, or Officer Kim, tried to keep people away from the alley, regular citizens around him began to help him with crowd control as well, directing others around them to back off. So he really managed to get people to listen to him, even though they're in the situation where it is very hard to hear what anyone is saying, even a police officer who's yelling at the top of his lungs. At 10:30 p.m., the security cameras on World Food Street show that the crowd is now moving westward away from the alleyway, presumably directed to do so by Sergeant Kim, any other officers who've arrived, and others within the crowd. But even as they do so, the crowd in the alleyway cannot move at all, many of them for good reason. While the security camera footage sped up for the Korea Now video in the list of sources shows people on World Food Street scurrying around like ants at 5 to 8 times the speed, the alleyway camera footage is almost a still photo as of 10:35 p.m., even though it is also sped up. Someone just below the camera waves what looks like a lit lightsaber toy over the heads of those trapped in the alleyway, illuminating just how dire the situation has become. It doesn't matter that you can't really see the faces in this particular security video. When you can see people just barely moving at all, like I said, it's basically a still photo. And yet, when you look at the speed of the video, it is going like 8 times what it's supposed to. That's how tangled up this crowd is. Imagine, if you will, a hillside covered with trees planted as tightly together as possible. If something were to knock them all down, an avalanche, a strong wind, a mudslide, those at the top would be on the upper layer of the logs which slid down the hill. The smart thing to do would be to remove them first so as to extract the ones underneath, not start with those that are underneath, because they're going to be trapped under the other ones. You're not going to be able to move it. You're going to have to take those ones off the top first. But when rescue personnel finally start arriving at the scene in more more numbers as of like 10:30. They naturally did so on the major thoroughfare close to the subway station, not on the still packed World Food Street. So that's the way they approached the pile of bodies outside the shoe store and the hip hop club. They walked up this sloping road. They're telling people who are in front of this crowd, who have already started to move away from the crowd crush, go down the hill. Get out of the alleyway. Just keep going, keep going. And then they're starting to come in to face this crowd crush. And that is how they approach, a pile of people 10 feet high that, 10 heads high that you can't pull out. And just like in crushes, like the one at the front door at the station nightclub and the Shiloh Baptist Church, which we've covered before, you couldn't just yank people out that way. Those on the bottom could be trapped under a weight of something like half a ton. They've got like 5 or 6 people on top of them. You just start doing the math, and that is a lot of weight. There were people in the crowd who were passing out, who were throwing up because they couldn't stop themselves. One of the survivors said that at some point in all of this, she felt something cold go down her leg, and she just thought it was somebody who had spilled a beer or somebody who had dropped a drink or something along those lines. But she realized later that what it was that somebody who was dying had vomited on her leg. And that is kind of it's not a very nice detail, but it gives you some idea of, I think we all know how vomit works at this point, and we know that it is not cold. So the fact that she thought, there's something cold dripping down my leg, and it was what it was, is kind of indicative of just how badly off the person who did that all over her was. The alleyway security camera shows people at the top of the alleyway being removed one by one, layer by layer, from the top of the alleyway as of around about 10:37 p.m. But as those layers are being removed from the top, the middle of the alleyway directly above the camera isn't moving. The mass of people there are eerily still. Within 2 minutes, people can be seen at the bottom attempting to help remove others from the pile. However, it's only taken 15 to 20 minutes for many of those in the crowd to stop moving entirely. You can definitely see, even in the security camera footage that isn't clear, that is just as bad as every other security camera footage you have ever seen in your life, you can still tell that some of these people are unconscious at best. In cell phone video posted by All K-Pop on Tumblr, Twitter, how many social media sites can I name? On TikTok, in front of the Waikiki's wraparound porch, there are just this pile of prone bodies. They're pulling people off, and there's just a bunch of people just lying there, not moving. Other videos and photos posted to social media gave people in South Korea and soon enough around the globe, told them that what happened in Itaewon had cost the lives of dozens. The first photos and videos many people saw of the victims were of civilians at first and then paramedics giving unconscious people CPR. Many of them would give up or be told to stop by paramedics after only a few short minutes. There's only so long that you can bring somebody back with CPR who's been crushed to death. The head of the emergency services at one of the local hospitals, I believe, he's in the documentary Crush, and he says something along the lines of, there was a point at the beginning of all this when they're starting to find out about it that they start seeing these images on social media, and he's saying, why are there people, like regular people, giving CPR to these injured people, these deceased people, when it should be paramedics? Where are they? Where are the emergency personnel? And that is an excellent question. In a TikTok video posted by Dio Bix Love, a crowd across the street from a row of ambulances with their red lights flashing dances and chants, "Sex, sex, sex" on the beach, along with some song that we can barely hear. Now, they are across Itaewon Row from the alleyway. The caption states, "I have no words, this is truly disturbing," and then a puking emoji, followed by a swirling eye emoji. The sentiment isn't wrong exactly, but we know something that those in the crowd may not even comprehend at this point. It's easy to point fingers and be appalled by such behavior given over 150 people are dead or dying across the street from these people. But the point of view of the video, behind a crowd of people, the red lights with the line of ambulances just barely visible over their heads, the scope of the disaster going on only meters away from them is more than likely impossible to comprehend. First, you have to wrap your brain around the fact these ambulances aren't just there for people who've overdosed or had too much to drink or got in a fight. Your first thought when you see a bunch of ambulances isn't, oh my God, there's been some sort of crowd disaster. That is not your first thought. Your first thought, especially on a night like this, is maybe something caught fire. Maybe there was a fight. Maybe there was some sort of other problem. You're not thinking of people dying. That is not what you're thinking about. Even on a night like Halloween, where you're supposed to be thinking about spooky things, that's not your first thought. And so for those people across the street in Itaewon Row, over on Itaewon Row, they aren't seeing the same things that other people are. They don't know the things that other people are. There are people who are stumbling out of that alleyway, crying, knowing that their friends are still in there and are probably dead. And the people across the street, a lot of them cannot see that that is going on. They can't see when people are being pulled out of this alleyway limp and having towels put over them or body bags. You have to comprehend first that there's something going on that these ambulances are here for. And then you have to understand that a crowd of people have been crushed, something which might be difficult to fathom at the moment. After all, you're standing in a pretty tight crowd and you're fine. How bad can it be? It's really hard to wrap your brain around the fact that people might be getting crushed. This isn't something that happens all the time. It's not a disaster that is common. So for people to think that these are people that are all here because of a crowd crush, they might not know that, or they might not understand what is going on. Lastly, you have to be able to acknowledge that people have died. But even with the dead laid out across the street, ambulances may be blocking your view of them. You may not be seeing all of the bodies, just one or two. You may still think that they're unconscious or that they're fine, they're passed out, they're drunk. You tell yourself a lot of things when things like this happen. When bad things happen, you tell yourself, you walk into a place and if you find somebody passed away, you may think at first, they're just sleeping, or, you tell yourself things that make sense because seeing somebody who's deceased, we're not used to that for the most part. And so for you to walk into a room or to, show up someplace and there are, there's not just one person dead, but there are many people dead. That is something that is very difficult to wrap your head around. It is, even if you are seeing those bodies, like I said, you may be able to convince yourself in the moment. You've probably had something to drink and you can tell yourself, hey, they're okay. They're just resting. They've had too much to drink. They're just waiting for the ambulances. They're going to go to the hospital. They're going to get their stomach pumped and then they're going to go home and feel really bad about what they did on Halloween. That's the kind of thing that you tell yourself over and over again. In that instance, as you're standing in an energetic crowd with rhythmic music playing and maybe a little or a lot of alcohol in your bloodstream and maybe other drugs too, you have to shift from that to physically and mentally sober, because that is what's going to happen as soon as you realize that people have died. And it's very difficult to do that at any time. You may as well be in an entirely different universe, divided by that terribly still line of ambulances. Those ambulances, when you see them in video footage, a lot of them are just not moving. They're not taking anyone to the hospital. Some of them are, but many of them are just sitting there. Lights going, sirens flashing, and nothing. 159 people died when the massive Halloween crowd passing the streets near Itaewon metro station or subway station collided in a narrow alley on October 29th, 2022. 98 of the victims, 1/3 of the total body count, were women. 26 were foreigners, including the two Americans, Steve Blessey and Anne Geisk. 11 of the dead were just teenagers. One of the victims was not lost to the crush, but due to it. Several days after staying alive in Itaewon while two of his friends didn't make it, a 17-year-old high school student lost his life to suicide, becoming victim number 159. Now, I would definitely count that person as a victim. Other people might not. In the documentaries that I've seen, everybody treats that particular person like yet another victim of Itaewon. One of those who died in Itaewon that night was well known in Korea, 24-year-old Lee Ji-han. Having been discovered on the boy band reality competition Produce 101, Lee was eliminated early but was looking like he'd grow a successful acting career. He'd previously been in a web drama, Today Was Another Nam Hyun Dae, and was in the process of filming Kukdu's Gai Geo, which I'm probably mispronouncing something, and I apologize if I am. But he was, he's getting up there. He's getting a career. You can spot him in the crowd. I know there are videos on TikTok where people have been able to spot him in the crowd, as far as I can tell. I didn't try to because, like I said, it's really hard in a lot of these videos to tell people apart because they're just so tangled and they're just so pushed up against one another. There's a lot of people with dark hair, and so that, unless you can see faces, and even then it can be difficult. People are wearing masks, people are wearing makeup. It's just really hard to pick people out of the crowd unless you know them really well and you can spot that face and say, or they're really standing out. So that is a little bit of an issue I had trying to figure out, if any of these videos might actually point to Lee Ji-han, but the important thing is not so much, there he is. It's the fact that he did not make it out of that alleyway alive. In the hours after the victims of the crush were removed, the alleyway was still littered with the detritus and belongings dropped during the chaos. It really looks not so much like a something terrible, a tragedy, a crowd crush happened there. It looks like any other Halloween nights. The morning after, there's all kinds of stuff that people dropped as they went out bar hopping. Like, that's what it looks like. It looks like somebody needs to come through with a broom and clean the streets. That's what it needs. But that alleyway, despite all the stuff that's all over it, that there are things missing. They've taken personal items that were there and taken them away, but it really does look like a mess in that alleyway. In a YouTube video posted by Kieran Porey, who was in Itaewon that night, Porey shows footage of his passage through the crowds prior to the disaster, although he does not appear to have gone up or down the alleyway. Porey went to a club with friends. While they were there, rumors rose of 3 people dying in a car accident nearby. Porey and his friends began checking social media, where photos of the bodies from the disaster were popping up all over. Not long after, some of the bars and clubs on World Food Street and the surrounding area began to close down and shut their doors. Not all of them, just some of them. So there are some clubs who are telling everybody, you have to go, we're closing down. There's been something bad that's gone on, but you need to leave. And that, like I said, that wasn't everybody. Some of the bars and the clubs and the restaurants were still open. Porey and his friends can be heard talking about the incident outside the club as officers walk past, holding up loud alarms to disperse the crowd. The exact wording of what Porey and his friends say is not clear. Again, lots of loud music, lots of people talking. You can't really hear their precise wording. I can't quote exactly what they were saying, but you can pick up enough from what they say to understand that despite the fact they're about a block or two away from the alleyway, they still have no clue what is happening. But they note that the clubs and bars shutting down is far from a perfect solution. This is just creating more chaos, a woman's voice says in English. All of the friends are pretty much saying that. They're opening these doors and they're letting people out into the streets, and meanwhile they're trying to get the streets uncrowded, which it seems like you would leave the people who are in these bars and clubs until you get everything sorted with the crowd control issue. When Porey and his friends emerge onto the main road, they're shocked by the dozens of ambulances and police cars on Itaewon Row. The woman notes that she's never seen anything like this, even when she lived in London. After they pass exit number 3 to the subway station heading west, the high-pitched warning of police whistles is constant. Yet despite all this, Porey and his friends are still in the area at 2:18 a.m. as Porey records their walk down a crowded street where pizza joints and kebab shops are still open. This is actually across Itaewon Row from where everything is happening in the alley. So it's almost like they're out of harm's way, and so nobody has to worry anymore. It's not really the case, as we'll see in a sec. Now, the Ministry of the Interior and Safety did send out emergency messages regarding the disaster to cell phones throughout the area that night. Messages were sent through the Emergency Ready app to anyone who set their location as the Yongsan district. They were sent in Korean, but translated to English by the app if you set your phone to do so. But you had to do so in the app, where you might not know to do so. The first warning went out at 11:55 p.m., mentioning an incident in Itaewon. Now, I couldn't find a quote on what exactly they sent out, but it basically seems a little bit vague about what that particular incident was. About 15 minutes later, so it's about 12:11, if I remember correctly, another message warned everyone away from Itaewon, excuse me. So telling everybody, go home, or at least don't be here. And, we're dealing with an issue. You need to stay away. At 12:51 p.m., a third message told everyone, just go home. Yet in Kieran Porey's video from that night, the streets are still packed nearly an hour and a half later. They're not dangerously packed as they were before, but there's still a lot of people who are out despite what has gone on. I don't know if you heard that, but I really apologize if you heard me burp. I don't know. Okay. At the One Hero Sports Club, authorities laid out the victims' belongings on sheets on the floor, neatly labeled and spread as much as possible to allow for proper identification. Shoes sat paired up in tiny rows and columns like little soldiers, having come loose from the owner's feet in the crush, just like that sneaker that the sergeant and the chief saw held up earlier. They had just come off people's feet because they had basically been pulled right out of them. Among the everyday clothes, jeans, sweaters, jackets, costume pieces, and colorful wigs and masks intermingled. I've seen multiple times while doing this podcast where people's belongings following a disaster are sort of, they're taken to a temporary morgue and they're lined up so you can go and you can say, that's my wife's purse, that's my daughter's hat, like those sorts of things. Those are my son's shoes, that kind of a thing. And in this particular instance, it was kind of jarring to see you have, just regular shoes, high heels, whatever. And then amongst all of those, you'll see like a pink wig or like a crown or something along those lines. Like there's all kinds of different things that you see that are from people who wore costumes that night and died in this crush. The dead, on the other hand, were taken to a temporary morgue at the One Hyo-ro multi-purpose gym, but not immediately. In Undercover Korea, the fiancé of Lee Ju-young, who lost her life in the crush, tells how he asked the rescue personnel to remove Ju-young before untangling him from the crush. They were kind of like right near each other, and he basically, he pulled her out first. She was out of it. She was unconscious as far as I understood him. They did so, placing her inside the hip-hop club at 11:20 p.m. She was then moved down to the main road along with others who died or who were seriously injured. Then she was moved into the dentist building on the lower western corner of the alley, where she stayed until 2 a.m. Her fiancé ended up in the dentist building as well, along with 40 others. As he recalls, he was the only one there who was still conscious. He could remember Ju-young's father showing up and begging to be let in, only to be turned away by officers at the door. And the fiancé says, basically, I really wish they would have let them in so they could have gone over to Ju-young, and if she was still alive, they could have held her hand as she passed away, but they didn't. This was not remotely the first deadly crowd crush in South Korea, although it had been 63 years since the previous deadliest crush in the country's history. On July 17th, 1959, Busan Municipal Stadium was packed with people when the skies opened up and rain poured down. It came down so fast, in fact, that water rose high enough in the stadium to force a crowd of people toward an entrance too small to fit them all. 67 people would be crushed to death as a result. Then in January of 1960, as people crowded Seoul Station to grab a seat on a train for the Lunar New Year, 31 people would die and 40 would end up injured. 20 years later, 1,000 students at a Busan elementary school pushed down the stairs on their way to an assembly. The ensuing tumble would kill 5 children and injure another 11. Then over the course of the following decades, 4 more crushes took place at Korean concert venues, although only one left more than one person dead. From 1992 onward, every 4 or 5 years or so, someone would be crushed to death at a concert. There's like a hip-hop concert, a New Kids on the Block concert, and a Korean group that I think was named Click B, I think they said. But basically, it's this. It's concert after concert. People are going and they're dying. But it's like one person or 2 people. In 2005, it was 11. But after that, there were none up until Itaewon. It became clear almost immediately that a large part of the problems which led to the Halloween crowd crush could have been solved with one simple decision: more policing. Everyone knew what Halloween in Itaewon was like. It's not like this was a surprise. Everyone knew that after 2 years shut in by the pandemic, the young people who celebrated Halloween in Itaewon wouldn't miss the opportunity to join in on the festivities. With crowd estimates of 100,000 people flooding the area, it seemed like common sense that the area should be covered from one end to the other with officers maintaining crowd control. Maybe they could shut down Itaewon Row about a week before the crowd crush. At Halloween, there was a food and culture festival, which had a parade that went along Itaewon Row, and they had shut that road down so the parade could go through. And there were far fewer people on the streets for that than there were for Halloween. And for the officers, for anyone to say we didn't know it was going to be like that would be ridiculous, because it was like that every Halloween. It was like that, it was always packed in Itaewon on like a Friday night, a Saturday night, people going out to have fun and party. Like that was the place to go. And so this is not any sort of surprise. But between eyewitness accounts from that night, documentation from the authorities in question, and video from Itaewon, it was clear that there were barely any police to be seen that night. The task force formed in the wake of the disaster to investigate the crush consisted of 475 officers. The streets of Itaewon on that October night only had a third of that number of officers walking that streets, according to the police. 58 as uniformed police officers, and 79 sniffing out drug violations while undercover. So there were only 58 people walking the streets of Itaewon who are in their uniform, who are trying to stop people, like by being present, by being visible. Oh, look, there's a police officer. Maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe we shouldn't do that. Keeping an eye out for fights, keeping an eye out for drunk and disorderly in public, or whatever else that might be, that might be a crime that they may have to deal with. It should be added also that Seoul had a specific situation for nights like this. Prior to events like Halloween, when the police know an area will be busy, they can bring in mobile police, who are exactly like what they sound like. They are mobile, they can go wherever they are needed, and when they're needed. On October 24th, the Itaewon substation called their higher-ups and requested mobile assistance that Saturday night. And that was plenty of time for them to say, okay, well, we're going to send a mobile unit down to you. They showed up on Saturday to discover no mobile police have been provided. The police district also produced a report several days before Halloween describing how the Halloween holiday crowd, needed to be handled to prevent a tragedy. I don't know if I need to say this, but that report wasn't acted upon at all. 3 days after the disaster, someone deleted the report. An investigation into that report, and just who deleted it, led the vice chief of the intelligence team, one of the people being investigated for that deletion, to take their own life. Suicide also claimed an official in the safety division. So it sounds like there were, multiple people who suffered from PTSD. When you see interviews with people, nearly every single one of them is having survivor's guilt. They're all saying, I don't know why I lived and all these other people had to die. I don't know why I lived and Steven had to die. I don't know why I lived and Anne had to die. I don't know why I lived and Ju Young had to die. Like it's every single person that you hear from says exactly that. And so the fact that suicide might take lives in the aftermath of such a tragedy is not surprising. It's sad and it's unfortunate. But then in this particular case, you have two people who may have felt guilty for the fact that so many people died, not because they survived, but because they could have done something about it earlier, and they didn't. With a police station within walking distance of the alley, questions arose about just how long it took for police to realize that something was going terribly wrong near the subway station. It would turn out that the first emergency call to police didn't come in around 10 o'clock when the crush was at its worst, or 9 o'clock when it was kind of starting to get a little tight on World Food Street. But the first call to authorities regarding the size of the crowd and the need for crowd control came in at 6:34 p.m., 3.5 hours before Sergeant Kim rushed out of his station to discover a disaster happening just outside the walls of his station, basically like right down the street. In the call, a woman tells the emergency services, quote, I'm in the alley towards the convenience store in Itaewon. There are too many people trying to go up and down the alley. It's too dangerous. People can't move, but they keep coming down. I think they're in danger of being crushed. I barely made it out. Police were recorded in the area with sirens on and lights ablaze at 7:05 p.m. There's video of it, but it doesn't look like that many. It looks like a few people showed up a couple of police officers showed up to kind of get people moving, and then they left. Over the course of the evening, emergency services would receive a series of 12 phone calls from 6:34 p.m. to 10:15 p.m. in which people in the area of the Hamilton Hotel expressed the growing concerns about the uncontrolled crowd. The first at 6:34 came from the woman standing at the base of the alleyway, and police were dispatched at that time. 3 more of the other calls to emergency dispatch would result in police being sent to the scene, but it's next to impossible to spot any officers in the crowd aside from Sergeant Kim. Granted, Sergeant Kim is kind of making himself very visible at that time. Other officers may have been there. Even he says, there were other officers around somewhere. I don't know where they were. They may have been at the front of the crowd at that point. But the fact remains that at the top of the hill, you've got Sergeant Kim making himself very, very visible, and you can't really see anybody else. For each of these calls, it was noted, in the police record that police were sent, people were cleared, and the issue was resolved. The issue is resolved. The issue is resolved. It says it at the end of every one. And clearly, it was not resolved. Then came 10:15 p.m. At that time, the situation inside the alleyway became so untenable that a number of emergency calls ramped up. According to Undercover Korea, emergency dispatch received 87 emergency calls about the crush in Itaewon between 10:15 p.m. and 12:56 a.m. In some of those calls, the cries and screams of the suffering could be heard in the background. People went from yelling, "Go back," over and over, to simply screaming, and then went silent underneath the pile. So that's 2.5 hours, 2 hours and 40 minutes, give or take. You divide that by 90? That is, almost 3. So like 2.5. Every 2.5 minutes, you're getting a call about this crush in the alleyway. 2.5, 3 minutes. You're getting a call saying there's a crowd crush. You send people. What happened within the alley that turned into a death trap is easily understandable for anyone who's been in a busy shopping area, a fairground, a city street. Given that it's summer up here in the Northern Hemisphere, and I'm kind of a country girl, let's use a fairground as an example. When you're on the main thoroughfare, it can be easy to follow exactly where the crowd ahead of you is going. People going in one direction are on one side, people in the opposite direction are on the other side. We might follow driving rules, stay on the right to go forward in the US, for example. we tend to understand that if we're going to cross that flow of traffic going in the opposite direction to get a funnel cake or a fried stick of butter or whatever carnival nonsense we want to eat in the United States, we're going to have to excuse ourselves as we cut across. When pathways get tighter and everything gets narrower, the rules about staying on one side still apply, but it can get a little more messy to do things like swerve around someone, walking too slowly for our taste, or stopping to shop at a t-shirt kiosk. Sometimes we start dividing into more alternating lanes, but it's still safe. It might be uncomfortable to keep bumping into people or have to maneuver from one lane to another, but we manage. The thing is, with a carnival, there usually aren't set walls that can move. There's that can't move. There's tents and there's kiosks and there's places where you can move out of a crowded thoroughfare and into an open and safe area. I've done this. There have been people in my way and I've walked into like a tent full of like handmade signs. I don't want any signs, but I'm in here because it's either this or I try to walk around the group of people that's standing at that corner and I really don't want to. So I'm going to stay in here for a while and pretend I really like these signs with like hunting dogs on them holding dead ducks in their mouth. Like, I'm in here and I'm just looking at these signs. It's really nice, but I would really like those people to move out of the way. And it happens. Most of the people, let me see. In the case of those in that alley in Itaewon, the alley shared a trait with so many problem areas and fires and crowd crushes. Most of the people on World Food Street arrived in Itaewon on the subway. So when they got out of the subway, they went up to World Food Street on the first alley they saw, right next to the Hamilton Hotel. They're coming out of exit 1, and that's the first way they see to get to World Food Street. So they go up that road. The same goes for those who got to the site early and decided to leave when the crowd started to become a problem. They simply headed back down the way they came, down into the mouth of the alley between the Troubadour and the Waikiki. At first, this wasn't a problem. The normal walking lanes applied until they divided into more lanes. More people who were arriving on site at around about 8 or 9 or only just getting off of the subway entered the alley and encountered a heavy flow of people who knew just how packed World Food Street was and were headed to the subway to go somewhere else. Maybe to another party, maybe just home, maybe to a bar somewhere else. As the crowds thickened from both directions and the clock approached 10, the approaching crush was inevitable. Another problem was that the Hamilton Hotel, the Hip Hop Club, the Waikiki, all had built out their own buildings with extensions that narrowed the alley even farther. The Waikiki's patio wrapped around the upper western corner of the alleyway, helping to clog an already narrow space. One survivor interviewed in an episode of Undercover Korea noted that at least some of those who fell did so in front of the Hip Hop Club, just below the beach club's patio and near a set of raised steps. You can see it if you look at this in like video clips. You can't see it in the ones obviously where people are standing up, who are packed into that alleyway. But when it empties, you can see there are a couple of raised steps on the right hand side when you're going down. And then on the left hand side, there's like a raised step against the wall. So that could be where Ari and Steven stood on to kind of try to get out of the way. People are sitting there later after the crowd crush is kind of dispersed and after they're pulled out of the crowd crush. I believe it's Seta who sits down on this bench, or Ari, it might be Ari, who sits down on this step on the side to kind of collect herself and calm down. And yeah, if I'm remembering correctly, it was Seta, and somebody came up to her and said, do you need any help? And this man, kind of got out of her that she was, wondering where her friends were, and that she got in contact with Bianca, and Bianca said, I'm over at the subway, and I can't move, my leg is numb. So this man went over and very kindly picked Bianca up and carried her back to the alleyway to be reunited with Seta, and so those two could be together and at least support one another. And it was it's a small thing on a night where so much tragedy had happened to be able to get two friends back together again. The steps that those raised steps by the Waikiki Beach Club. Waikiki Beach Pub, that may be where Sergeant Taylor and Chief Beathard were able to get up. It's kind of hard to tell. Like, they say that they got up into the entrance to the hip hop club, but you can't see it very clearly in most of the clips I saw. I mean, they're doing all this, kind of all these nice shots of the alleyway, and they're not really trying to get, shots of the front of these stores, so that was particularly difficult. But I mean, there's something there that's raised that they were able to get on, and you can see that they're standing on this in the pictures of them that night. But there are obstructions. Clearly, there are obstructions in that alleyway that narrowed it on the side. The Hamilton Hotel erected several extensions to the hotel, all of them permitted under Seoul's hand wavy regulations. I say permitted. I should probably say, like, scare quotes, permitted, like that kind of a thing. It's really not supposed to be there, and yet they're there. They put up a temporary wall. There's a terrace. There's a booth attached to the hotel, and that took up even more valuable space in the alley. The alleyway is only 10 feet or 3.2 meters across at its narrowest point near the bottom where the hotel's terrace is located. When the Hamilton Hotel would get cited for the extensions, like they were supposed to be, they'd simply pay the bill, accumulating $350,000 in enforcement fees in the course of almost a decade, and fulfilling the warning, a fine is a price. You pay the fine, you go home, you get to keep your illegal terrace for another year. It's something businesses and rich people get to do. They get to just pay a fine and not really think about it. Whereas when you're poor and you get fined, you are in bucket loads of trouble. And then there was the disorganized nature of Halloween in Itaewon. There is no organizing body for the Halloween festivities in Itaewon, or at least there wasn't in 2022. Sure, you might be saying that's understandable, right? There's not official. There's no central celebration location like a specific bar or club. No one's paying entry fees or anything. You're just getting dressed up in costume and going bar hopping, which is all true. But because Halloween in Itaewon didn't have anyone in charge of it, no one was consulting with the authorities to inform them of crowd numbers and expected police response. Granted, the police should have been able to anticipate a higher than normal attendance than previous years just based on the COVID shutdowns and regulations, which had everyone shedding their cabin fever. And in fact, they did. We know they did because they wrote that report prior to the Halloween night festivities. They asked for help. They did all of that, and nothing happened on that night. The police knew the attendance estimates from previous years and could have made an educated guess that Halloween 22 would be the party to end all parties. Literally, for some, as it turned out. There were, I think they said in 2019, there were 59,000 people. But even if you figure that it is maybe 70,000 people, 80,000 people, the estimate that they were getting was 100,000 people. And that's still more than the number of people who were there the week before for a festival that was, perfectly coordinated. Everybody was taken care of. The roads were shut down. People were able to move safely about the neighborhood. Like, everything was ready for that, but not for Halloween in Itaewon. The lack of coordination or organization for the Halloween celebrations may seem like an unnecessary extra step for a trained police district, but they're also not wrong either. However you may feel about police officers, there's only so many hours in the day, and officers probably have a million other things to do that they judge to be more important to their job. I'm not exactly sure how long it would take. God knows we've all been there, where you get handed something that you're supposed to do, but there's a bunch of other things that you really need to do first, or that you'd rather be doing, or you think is more important. And in this particular instance, it's not like they didn't ask for this, but it may have helped push forward their ability to get the officers on the ground that they needed to control the crowd, if there was an organizing body behind the Halloween celebrations saying, okay, this is how many we've had in previous years, this is how many we think we're going to have. You have to figure other people walking into the neighborhood, not coming directly to the station, or maybe taking a taxi or something along those lines. Like, somebody who could talk to the police and pressure them into making sure that there was crowd control that night. Expected attendance and possible safety concerns are exactly the sort of information an event organizer should be figuring out and passing on to the proper authorities. Halloween in Itaewon was freer to be less restricted in its early years, but 12 years later, and the holiday packed the streets from side to side, even during years when it didn't come immediately after South Korea dropped the outdoor mask rules after 2 years of pandemic. One official at the Yongsan district office would state, quote, "Since Halloween is American culture and there are many foreigners who come to Itaewon, businesses hold events of their own volition," as the reason why police didn't shut down Itaewon Row for that particular night. Given that response, employing an organizer might be a necessity in the future to prevent the Halloween celebrations from being dismissed or ignored because of their origins or because they're not seen as like an official Korean holiday. You're going to have people who are making decisions, and this comes up in several documentaries and several stories. You're going to have people making the decisions who are older, who are in their 50s and 60s, and that's that generation who sees all of this stuff that happens in Itaewon on regular nights and on Halloween as frivolous and a waste of time and money and dangerous and all of that. And unfortunately, they're the ones who are making the decisions about whether or not police should be sent to that area on a night like Halloween, where in some cases the response by people who were not involved, didn't lose anybody, didn't have anybody that they knew who lost somebody. There were some people who were implying or outright saying that the people who lost their lives that day didn't deserve a memorial because they brought it on themselves by going out to Itaewon and partying on Halloween night or Halloween weekend. It's ridiculous, and it's silly to think that, whether or not you brought something on yourself, quote unquote, it really shouldn't matter in regards to helping someone or remembering their loss. I've kind of soured in recent years on the term, the Darwin Award, because do people get Darwin Awards for doing things that they probably shouldn't do and getting themselves hurt or killed? Yes. Do I feel like they should be laughed at? I'm not sure. Like if somebody is not knowledgeable or educated enough not to do something, or they do something that we would credit as stupid or ignorant or something along those lines, and they get hurt or they get killed, they should be remembered or helped, even if we're not particularly thrilled with them, or they do something, or they're, I think I said to somebody the other day, I said, I want everybody to have health care. I want everybody to be able to get, free health care. Even the people I don't like, just because I don't like people who maybe are racist or bigoted or something like that, I may say yes, if they're getting themselves into a dangerous place with their mouth. Somebody may punch them, but I also want them to be able to go to the doctor and get their nose set afterwards and not have to worry about it. Like, it's one of those things where it shouldn't be what you did, or, just afterwards, you're just going to have to get taken care of. And that's just the way it is. Like, it shouldn't be a matter of, well, I don't think what they did was right. Well, that doesn't matter. It's a crowd crush. It's not something that they did on purpose. It was a complete and total accident. Or if you are closer to that, I know a lot of people think that, see it. I don't want to say think, because that makes it sound like they are incorrect. And it's arguable that they are correct, but there's still a lot of legal proceedings that have to go through, that this was intentional negligence, fatal negligence. And so that's something that needs to be considered here, that no matter what these people did who went to Itaewon to celebrate Halloween that night, it doesn't matter. No one deserves to die like that. After the sun rose in Itaewon the day after the tragedy, people began to stop at the site of the crush to leave chrysanthemums, South Korea's traditional mourning flower, outside the police tape cordoning off the area. Visitors who were there got to witness the moment when Nam In-suk, wishing to do something to honor the dead, brought out a tray from his store with a meal to give to fuel the victim's journey home. But after placing the tray on the ground and kind of kneeling to pray, Nam was approached by police who asked him to stop. In a video clip aired in the documentary Crush, Nam yells at a police officer, quote, "This is where it happened. We should at least feed the kids one last meal." Nam notes bitterly after this clip that the officers were all too eager to stop him from giving the victims a traditional final Korean meal, yet didn't bother to stop up that October night when it really would have mattered. To show up, when it really would have mattered. They were there to bother him. They were there at a point after all of this, when the president of South Korea was giving a speech or something along those lines, and there were anti-government protests. There were something like 6,000 police there to deal with that. And there were 58 uniformed police officers in Itaewon on the night of the crush. The probe into the Itaewon crowd crush would take 74 days to complete. According to their analysis of the security camera footage, the crowd density within the alleyway, as those outside the hip-hop club tumbled forward and became entwined, was 10.74 people per square meter. This in an alleyway that was only 4 meters wide to begin with. This means that at the northern end of the alleyway, there would have been, the top of the alleyway, I should say, there should be about one person per 1 square foot of space. To get some idea of how small that is, take your wrists, stick your arms out in front of you, take your wrists and kind of cross them over one another, and then hold them up in front of you like you're Wonder Woman deflecting a bullet. And that square that you see between your elbows when your arms are raised like that, that's the square you had to stand in on that night. That's about the size of it. Now, I'm doing this and I can barely get my arms over my chest because that's the kind of chest I have. And I can't imagine trying to fit into that space. And I'm 5'2". I may be a little fat, but I'm still 5'2". And so, that space, I'm not going to be able to fit into that space. So, to think of other people who, guys who are taller than me, people who might be bigger or, that sort of thing, that is not a space that anybody can fit into. The inquiry found that, according to Special Police Investigation Team Chief Son Ji-han, quote, "We haven't concluded that the deadly accident was caused by authorities' failure to come up with disaster preparation measures and respond promptly to an emergency situation," end quote. As a result of the investigation, 23 officials were referred to the prosecutor's office for possible fatal negligence charges. Those officials were mostly restricted to local authorities and law enforcement and emergency response, such as officers at the Yongsan police station. There was a police chief and there's a bunch of people who got brought up on charges. But those in city and federal positions were not found to be at fault. It was very much a local thing that they found people were guilty in regards to this for, or should be charged at the very least. The decision angered many of the families of the victims, who felt the South Korean government needed to be cited for safety failures higher up the chain. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol received particular scorn, as many family members wanted him, or any senior government official, to give them a proper apology. President Yoon, however, did no such thing. At one point, he even skipped a memorial service for those who lost their lives and attended a Christmas tree lighting ceremony instead. In fact, the first apology the families received from someone old enough to be a parent of one of the victims was from Nam In-suk, who apologized to the families as part of his testimony at the inquiry as a show of respect. He basically was at the testimony, went up, he sat in his chair and he said, somebody has got to apologize to these families, and if you're not going to do it, I will. And he didn't really have anything to apologize for. He did what he could on that night, and he did what he could for the kids after that night by preparing that final meal. And it's other older people in society who failed the kids in Itaewon that night. Speaking of people in the government being, convicted of something, on February 8th, 2023, the South Korean Parliament, or the Assembly, impeached Minister Lee Sang-min, 179 to 109, for the government's failings in preventing the crowd crush in Itaewon. Now, he is the Minister of the Interior and Safety, so that explains why he got impeached. Protests against the government had followed the disaster in Itaewon, and people wanted blood, at least metaphorically. Minister Lee was already target just as the leader of the Interior and Safety. It presumably didn't help that soon after the disaster, Minister Lee stated, quote, "It is our understanding that this incident could not have been avoided by deploying the police or firefighters in advance." A statement the minister would soon walk back. He said basically the same thing multiple times. Like, the police couldn't have done a thing. And it's like, no, they probably could have done some things. 5 months after his impeachment, however, the country's constitutional court found the impeachment unconstitutional, and Lee is still the Interior and Safety Minister as of the writing of this episode. So too is President Yoon, still the president. So I don't know if they're still working on something in those, in that line or anything like that. But, as far as I could tell, the charges haven't gone to trial for these people yet. But suffice it to say that what the families got was not all that they asked for. As for the city itself, Seoul responded to the following Halloween celebrations by enforcing far more control than they did in 2022. A new CCTV system went up prior to the holiday weekend, so police could keep a sharp eye on just how crowded the streets were getting. There would also be more cops on the streets to redirect crowds, enforce one-way roads, shut down the subway stations, arriving trains if necessary, or simply respond to emergencies in a more timely manner. In the weeks and months following the tragedy, the alleyway and subway station exit became a gathering place for mourners as well as a depository for the mementos and notes which loved ones and visitors would leave behind. In the alleyway, visitors turned the eastern wall towards Itaewon Row, so right at the front. They turned that into a makeshift memorial, writing to the dead on post-it notes and little pieces of paper and leaving their messages taped up on the wall. While the memory of the dead still lingers in the minds of those they left behind, it also fortunately lives on throughout Seoul as a warning that people need to heed. Just 3 days ago at S Factory, the Boiler Room Seoul 2024 concert was abruptly shut down at 1 a.m. after several people with respiratory issues had to be taken care of and sent home. The crowd in the club, meanwhile, also needed to be evacuated, be let out of the club. While it had only been days since the concert was shut down and an investigation may still need to be done, word is that the venue, which could only fit 2,000 people, sold around 6,000 tickets. Thankfully, no one was seriously injured or killed, but the possibility of that number of tickets having been sold raised a question among online commentators. Did Seoul learn nothing from the Itaewon tragedy? I mean, I don't personally believe that. I do think it did learn lessons from Itaewon. But I also think that there are people in Seoul, and this happens after every disaster, so it's not a specifically Korean thing or anything along those lines. It's just a matter of you have older people in positions of power and younger people who are still, they're just starting their lives. And the response to things like this is, you brought it on yourself, you walked into this, you shouldn't have gone out, you shouldn't have been partying, you shouldn't have done this, you shouldn't have done that, when it genuinely shouldn't matter. If this many people die, that's a tragedy. And it's not, a guilt thing or anything like that. Everything that happens like this is a tragedy. It is horrifying and it is upsetting. And it shouldn't be something where you're just willing to say, in the streets, we can take care of it now because we know that it was a problem. Well, it's also a problem when you have bars and clubs and restaurants that are so packed that when something like this happens, people can't just, go into a nightclub. When you have somebody like Chief Bethard and Sergeant Taylor, when you have the two of them getting out of this crowd by standing on the entrance to the hip hop club, and the bouncer there being like, you can't come in, you can't come in, you can't come up here, that sort of a thing, because I assume because there are too many people already in there. And so something like that is an issue as well. You can't just be like, okay, as long as they're not on the street, it's fine. Well, that's going to be an issue if one of these nightclubs catches fire, or if one of these nightclubs has a stampede from inside it, or both. That can happen as well. As I mentioned, the Station nightclub fire before, that's exactly what happened, is that people were trying to get out, and they get to the door that they came into, which, as we all know, if you've listened to this podcast from the beginning, you know, never leave out the door you came in. Go out another exit. That is the entrance that everybody will come through, and you do not want to try to go out that way in an emergency. So you go out another exit. But because people were heading toward that exit in the station, they were getting into this bottleneck where they had to turn left, and then they had to go into this narrow exit, and then they had to go down like a little sloping section of floor, and the first person to fall takes everybody down with them that's behind them. And so when you see the video of the Station nightclub burning down, you see a clip toward, I want to say about 3.5 minutes after the fire starts, where the man who had the camera, the news guy, he goes around the building for 30 seconds to the back door by the stage and sees it filled with fire. And when he left that front door to the club, there was nobody stacked up in that door. Everybody was walking out just fine. He comes back 30 seconds after he walked out that door, and there are people piled 5 or 6 high in that door, and people trying to pull them out, and it's just not working, because it's the same in this situation where people are tangled up and you can't get pulled out because it feels like your legs are break, or they're going to pop off, or something along those lines. It's you're trapped between people. And not only that, you're trapped between people in a burning building. It's the only way something like Itaewon could have gotten worse. And if you're not ready to, double check and make sure that things like this concert, if there were that many tickets sold, that they're not doing that. Because if only 2,000 people can fit into a venue and you sell 6,000 tickets, I mean, you're asking for another Itaewon. You're asking for that alleyway to happen all over again in your nightclub. And it seemed from the response that I saw from one of the artists who was supposed to perform and didn't get to because they closed down the nightclub before she could, that it really needs to kind of stick into the minds of the artists who perform there as well, to be able to say, hey, this place is packed. Does it really need to have this many people in it? This is unsafe. There is, I imagine, a portion of your brain that is saying, oh, I'm going to make so much money tonight. But also, like, you may make money, but if people, there is a stampede or there is a crowd crush and people die as a result, do you really want that money? Would you rather be safe, or would you rather make much more money than you were expecting and possibly people die? So that's something for Seoul to keep in mind. That's plenty for a lot of people to keep in mind. I think a lot of countries, when a tragedy happens, it within a week, it kind of slips most people's minds because you're too busy thinking about other things, especially now. There's just so many terrible things that happen now that, like, something happens and within a week you didn't even realize. You're like, oh, wait, that happened a week ago? That happened this weekend? That happened, like, you can't wrap your brain around it. I think, I believe that somebody that I follow on Tumblr shared a post where they had made a spreadsheet of all of the things that had happened in the news from the time of the presidential debate to the time that President Biden dropped out. And it was only about 4 weeks. And it was so many things, just so many things that happened over the course of that time period. And it really hit home looking at it, like, regardless of how you feel about the news and politics or anything like that, it's just so much news and so many bad things happening. Oh, just one after another. And you're just thinking like, why? There's a reason I started a Twitch channel, and it's just for streaming me putting together my mini dollhouses. And the reason that I did that was so that I could make a schedule and make sure that I sat down on a semi-regular basis. I'm still trying to get the schedule part down, but what I'm doing is basically at least 1 hour a day, if I can manage it. I am going on Twitch and gluing things together and cutting things and taping things. Like, it's all kinds of different things that I'm doing, and I'm really not doing it so that people can watch, but if you want to, you can go ahead. I'm on there as OG Troll Princess, and you can watch me do this, during weekdays. I don't know exactly when, because God knows, like I said, I'm still trying to get the schedule thing going, but it's forcing me to turn off my phone, or at least set it up so it can, take recordings for my Twitch channel, and I'm just sitting there. I turn off the radio, I close up the laptop, I start working on this, and it forces me to not look at the news, not look at social media, anything like that. I just put on some music, or the other day I had on gymnastics from the Olympics just so I could watch, and it was just a really great idea to kind of force myself into a corner and say, hey, you need to take a break. My mental health for the past few weeks, or for the past month, since my tires needed to be replaced, and I've been having a lot of trouble catching up with my bills. And so I've just been really broke and really in a bad place mentally, and it's just, really stressed out. And then I got sick the last week or so, and I've just been feeling absolutely awful. And the fact that I got this episode done at all is a miracle. But the thing is that things like this happen in the news, things like the Itaewon Halloween crush, and they happen and then they're gone. Like a week later, we've got something else to worry about that's just as bad, or something terrible that's been said, or people have been hurt, or there's just so many. A new law has been passed, which is awful. The Supreme Court has made a decision, which is terrible. All of them lately. The problem with being a history buff is that you end up reading a lot of history involving, things like the Supreme Court, and regardless of, good decisions that they've made, you can usually tell when they're starting to make pretty bad ones. And this is definitely a Supreme Court that's making some bad decisions. But anyway, yeah. I'm going to take a drink. And I should be done at this point. So I didn't know that this episode was going to be 2 parts. I thought it was maybe a little longer episode, but it's really, there's a lot to talk about. Like I've said for the past 2 hours, it's just, there's a lot of stuff that went on in regards to Itaewon and the crush there that night. There's a lot to share and a lot to talk about. So, but if you do want to watch something, I would suggest Crush. It's an excellent documentary. It's on Paramount Plus, and it's brilliant. There is, fair warning, there are shots of people who are being crushed. You can see like people who are deceased, and so you're going to see that. If you don't want to see that, you might not want to watch, or you might want to skip ahead at some point. So when you get to the point where people are starting to be in the crush and when the crowd is starting to be bad, you could skip ahead until you start seeing sunlight, because I think sunlight's a pretty safe bet to get to that point. I think that is towards the end of episode 1, because it's a 2-episode documentary, and the first episode is the start of the crush, and then the second episode is it's the process. The crush is still in the process of happening, and so the first, I want to say 20-30 minutes are just people trying to get out of it, people being pulled out of it, people dying, all of that. So you might just want to put on that second episode and just move ahead until you see sunlight, because sunlight is when they show the clip of people arriving at the site to leave chrysanthemums, and Naminduk Insuk leaving food for the deceased out. So, but I can't recommend that enough. I'm trying to think of something else I want to say. If there's anything else I want to say. Not really. I've said a lot in 2 hours. A lot. So I am going to step back now. I'm pretty proud of myself that I finally finished this episode. I've just, like I said, my health has been really terrible all month, and I'm broke, and I have just been trying to work on this, and it's really hard, really difficult when you're in a bad place mentally. So thankfully I've gotten this done, and I can start working on new episodes, hopefully, and get back on track to where I was before. I wish I could, kind of point to the series on Uvalde and say, that's why I'm like this. But I don't think that was it. I was fine with Uvalde, and then my tires blew. I blew out my tire in a pothole. I live in Pennsylvania. There's potholes everywhere, but for some reason I'm the only person in my family who hits potholes and needs to get replacement tires like over and over again. So I needed to replace all 4 tires, because God forbid I only replaced the one. And that cost me $610, and that was a whole week's paycheck. So that was great. That particular week, that was not good. But hopefully I can catch up a little bit, and we'll see how that works out. But I'm going to try to see what I can do next. I do still want to work on the super outbreak from 2011 tornadoes, just at the very least in honor of Twisters, which I still haven't seen, by the way. I know somebody's going to ask, and I still haven't seen it, by the way. I probably should go, maybe tomorrow if I have money, which I don't, but at this particular point, I think it's only fair that I go see it. I did see Deadpool and Wolverine with my brother last Thursday, and it rocked. It was amazing. It was everything I hoped it would be and more. It was so great, and I loved it. It was so much fun, especially if you're a total comic book fan like me and my brother. We're huge comic book fans. So the Deadpool movies have actually been pretty dependable in terms of not screwing up with, characters and casting and all of that. Everything that was in that movie was chef's kiss. It was brilliant. So I can't recommend it enough, which says a lot, because I've been souring on the MCU the past few movies, but this one's been this one was a good one. So fingers crossed. I think it was probably because of Ryan Reynolds, and I'm grateful that he actually loves that character so much that he does it really well. But until next time, guys, stay safe.